Hello, everyone. Welcome to TPS training. This is Lewis Weber with Behavior Care. In this training, we're going to take a look at the G series of graphs and tables. You'll note that I am on the G3 right now. We also have G1, and with all of the TPS sequences of graphs that have a 1, 2, and 3, the 1 is going to refer to daily performance. 2 is going to be weekly performance, and the 3, G3, is going to be monthly, and if we scroll down, quarterly performance. Most of the time when I do a graph training, I start with the daily graph and then move to the weekly graph and finish with monthly, quarterly graph. But because of the complexity of G3 data displays, it's easier, it will be easier to start with the G3. And the reason for that is that the graphs have so much information packed into them. It's easier to start to explain them by first looking at these kinds of information. And you can see there are three different kinds of information, three dimensions of performance, if you will, for each target behavior. So these three different kinds of information are going to be encoded in each of these graphs. And you'll see we have a dot and a line. And there are different properties of this line that we're going to talk about. They're going to correspond directly to these three columns. So let's begin with what these columns mean, and then we'll see how the graph is going to depict them. So the G3 table that's at the top here is probably the single most informative table in TPS because it's showing progression over time and monthly summaries of that progression in this case. And it's going to show the rating percentage is the percentage of rating points that have been earned during each of the recording blocks. If a student earns all fours, the student would earn 100% in this column. Of course, if the student earned all zeros, it would be 0%. So the range 0 to 100, and it reflects the kinds of ratings that the student has earned. The more fours and the fewer lower ratings, the higher the percentage is going to go. Just a common sense approach on that. Occurrence is also a percentage. Occurrence is the percentage of the recording blocks during which the student did some kind of behavior, and that's behavior recorded by the target behavior name. In this case, it would be respect. So the percentage of occurrence is the percentage of those recording blocks in which some level of respect occurred. It could be a 1, it could be a 4, it could be a 2 and a 3, of course, not a 0. So a 0 is not being recorded as an event in occurrence. We're only looking at the percentage of the recording blocks where there's some non-zero value. Now with the increasing targets, these percentages tend to be rather high. The reason is that most of the time, a student is earning at least a 1. And because occurrence does not distinguish between a 1 and a 2 or a 3 or a 4, what we see is just a measure of it happened. And most of the time, something happened in terms of the increasing target behavior, but not all the time. As we can see right here, for example, during August, Pete did not have 100% of occurrence for his respect. That means that, well, 7.8% of the time, 100 minus 92.2, 7.8% of the recording blocks. And when we talk about that, we don't want to say 7.8% of the time because that's a little vague. We want to say 7.8% of the recording blocks, available recording blocks, did not have some level of respect. So in other words, he got zeros during that 7.8%. So what we do see is pretty high percentages as a matter of course on the increasing targets, but not necessarily 100%. This measure will be more important, occurrence will be more important for the decreasing target behavior. Third column is intensity. And in prior years, this was expressed as a percentage, but it's more useful to express it as the average of the non-zero ratings. So this tells us how intense the behavior was when it occurred. If we want to see the total rating percentage, we look over here because this includes all numbers, and that means it includes zeros. So ratings are evaluating 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the reason why I say that is because we're using the, as you see up top here, 0 to 4 scale. So the rating is going to include all possible values, but intensity is going to look only at the non-zero values because the zeros don't contribute to an intensity concept. What I mean by that, if the student isn't doing the behavior, we don't want to include that zero rating in our measure of intensity because it's going to decrease the measure average and it will obscure the true intensity. That is to say, when the student exhibited the behavior, how intense was the rating or what was the average when the student did exhibit the behavior. Okay, let's hop over to here, the decreasing targets, because the way that I've been speaking about these the rating, occurrence, and intensity for the increasing targets are going to be similar all the way across here. But things change a little bit in terms of the meaning for the decreasing targets. Rating continues to be important. Rating, again, is the percentage of rating points earned and includes all data. And we can see actually in this case that the rating percentage is decreased over months down to 0, which is very good. Occurrence is very important for decreasing targets. It was not so important for the increasing targets because the student typically earns some non-zero value. In other words, there was some level of occurrence of an increasing target behavior. Maybe it was even a 1, but occurrence only considers that, well, that the target behavior occurred. It doesn't look at the value. Now, for decreasing target behaviors, occurrence is more important because we want to see zeros. We want to see only low values for occurrence. And so when we're looking at verbal aggression, it is sometimes useful to say how well, we say often, but what was the percentage of the recording blocks in which verbal aggression occurred? That's a meaningful assessment of behavior. And so occurrence is very helpful for decreasing targets because we don't want to see any of it at all. And when it does occur, it means that the situations, the conditions in the classroom were such that some verbal aggression occurred, and because we don't want to see any of it, the difference between not seeing it and seeing it is important. And so occurrence is an important measure for the decreasing targets. Now the third column is intensity, and that has the same meaning for increasing versus the decreasing targets. We want to see for decreasing targets zeros over here as opposed to for the increasing targets we want to see 4s. Here we're looking at the intensity. So this is how intense, in this case verbal aggression, how intense was verbal aggression when it occurred. So it's the non-zero values that are being summarized here. Okay, now one of the important things to keep in mind is that sometimes, particularly with these decreasing target behaviors, the rating percentage is going to be rather low because the student in certain cases will only infrequently be exhibiting the target behavior. Let's look at physical aggression to person. That's a pretty unwanted thing. We don't like to see that at all. And if we were only to look at the rating, we would say, well, the percentage has gone down considerably. That's really great. And it is good news because we want to see that rating percentage go down. Now, why did the rating percentage go down is going to require us to look at some of the other columns, because it could be that the rating physical aggression to person, and the intensity went down, or it is because um, the because Pete earned more zeros, because both of those kinds of outcomes are going to change the rating uh, percentage. Let me restate that. More zeros will decrease the rating, and lower ratings will decrease the ratings, and both will decrease the ratings. So we need to know which one of those three conditions actually occurred. Rating percentage just tells us that the overall rating went down, which is good. Now, question is he doing it less often and earning more zeros? Well, it turns out that, well, at least from the beginning of the school year to let's say November, forgetting about December because those are zeros, um, the 4 months right here actually did decrease. So the rating percentage went down. It went down because the occurrence went down, meaning more zeros. Now then the question is, what about the intensity when it did occur? Well, look at this. The intensity did not go down. In fact, the intensity stayed pretty consistent at 2.0. So what this tells us is that the rating percentage went down not because the intensity or the rating values went down, but because more zeros were earned. And in fact, when the physical aggression occurred, it remained at this level, which was, let's say, medium level. So the reason that we see the improvement in rating is not because Pete's physical aggression to a person was less intense, but because it was less occurring. That's where the effect is. So we have to look at all three of these columns. This tells us the overall effect. This tells us whether the effect of occurrence as it contributes to rating. This tells us the effect of the intensity of the rating as it contributes to this rating percentage. But this alone is not really enough information. We need to see how often it's occurring in terms of academic blocks, and when it occurs, what's the intensity. So we need all three of those measures, and that's why the G3 tends to be so useful when we use this table, because we can see these numbers, and also it tends to be more complicated because we have three different things that we have to consider. Now, when um, when we look at useful graphs in TPS or tables, this one is way up at the top because it tells us how, in very high detail, how the student is doing. And if you click over here and drag down, it copies both of these. If you want to copy just one of these, then you can start over here and copy that way. And if you wanted to copy just one of these columns, you would start in with the target behavior. Now, when I copy, I like to record or copy all of the target behaviors. In this case, we have 4 of them. And the reason why I like to do that is because it will keep the dates. If I were just to copy the center section here, the date isn't copied with it. Same thing for the decreasing target. So when I copy, I usually start with the month ending cell and then drag over to however many of the target behaviors I need. Okay, and then when I copy it, I paste it as a picture. Now I'm going to show you, I'm going to go ahead and copy it, and let's make believe I was in Word. I would paste, and in this case, I don't know if I have it here. Yeah, forget about that. I don't have that right menu. I would paste as a picture in a Word. Um, so that's something that's important to know. Don't want to just paste it. You want to uh, bring up the sub menu in Word, which will then allow you to paste as a picture. The reason why you want to do that, if you just click paste, because Word and Microsoft are, Word and Excel are all Microsoft products, just paste it. Word's going to want to try to maintain the original formatting of Excel, and that's not going to help you out so much. So paste as a picture. Okay, enough of that. Let's now look at these graphs, because what's going to happen here is these three columns, rating, occurrence, and intensity, are going to be captured by these graphs. So let's see what's going on here. The dots is the first column, rating percentage. Now, as I've been saying throughout this training, we need those other two columns to fully describe what's going on. Because if we just look at the dots, which is rating percentage, it doesn't give us the complete picture. So these vertical lines are now going to be used to describe occurrence and the relationship of the dot on the line, or the location, is going to be describing intensity. So here's how this works. All right, rating percentage again is just column one, first column, which is the percentage of the rating points that are earned. Now, when we look at occurrence, that is the top of the bars. Top of the bars is the occurrence percentage. When we go over here for August, the top of the bar is going to be 0.92. And as we scroll up here, or that's an average. So let's see, here it is. August, 0.92, or 92%. Right? As I go to the third month, it is 93.9%, which is what's showing right here. So the tops of the bars are going to be equivalent, or are equivalent, to occurrence. Now with the decreasing target behavior is exactly the same. The reason that we're not seeing the bars here is because they're too small. The size of the dot is obscuring the bar. Now in this case, we can actually see it. And let's see if it'll pick it up. So 23.5%, 0.235. 23.5% is the occurrence for verbal aggression. And there it is, 23.5%. So the top of the bars is occurrence. Now, intensity is shown by the location of the dot on the bar. So intensity is going to range from all fours, which would be the top of the bar, to all ones, that would be the bottom of the bar. And you say, well, what about zeros? Remember, intensity measures do not use zeros. So the bottom of the bar, it would be the place where the dot would go for an intensity of 1.0, because they can't go any lower than 1, right? Because only positive values, 1 through 4, are included in the intensity. Zeros aren't included. So the bottom of the bar is all ones. The top of the bar is all fours. Now, you say, well, if you got all fours and the dot would be at the top of the bar, why isn't it at 100%? And the reason is because of the zeros that were earned. So we can't, the bar can't go to the top, because as we remember from occurrence, in this case, 92%, 92% of the recording blocks had a non-zero value, but it turned out 7.8% did not. 7.8% had zeros. So because of those zeros, even if Pete earned fours in all of the other blocks, recording blocks, he could never get to 100%, because those zeros would have to be counted in to the percentage. So So that's why the bar starts to drop. The bar drops because occurrence moves the bar down as a result of the zeros that Pete has earned. So let's now stop for a second and review all this. The dot is the dot when it's read by this axis right here, by this vertical axis. This is the percentage of the rating points earned. That's column number one. The measure of occurrence is the top of the bar. Here it was 100%, or actually 97% for the second month. There it is right there, 97.9. And then it was 93.9, which is right here. So the top of the bar is occurrence, and the location of the dot on the bar is the intensity. As the dot travels up to the top of the bar, wherever the bar happens to end, the more and more intense measures, or closer to more fours, or all fours, was being recorded. If the dot is all the way at the top of the bar, wherever the bar happens to be, all fours were earned in the non-zero cells, the recording blocks, that is. So let's see, let's take a look. Here, the highest, or the occurrence is 93%. So if, for the third month, if Pete earned all fours for respect, except for when he earned zeros, the maximum value would be 93.9%. So that's the way occurrence and maximum percentage works in, because those zeros have to be included in the calculation for the maximum rating that he can earn, because he can, aside from the zeros, all of the other recording blocks can vary from 1 to 4 depending on the intensity of his behavior. So overall rating percentage, tops of the bars is occurrence, location of the dot on the bar shows intensity, and the dot can only go to the top of the bar. Now, you'll note that here, if the dot goes up to the top of the bar, for example, we would say it would be more intense. Now, in prior versions, that was expressed as a percentage. When the dot would go to the top of this bar, the third column here of intensity would be expressed as 100%. To make this table more useful, the intensity was recalculated to be an average of the non-zero values. So it ranges from 0 to 4. So even though when the dot goes up to the top, this is a percentage graph. When we look at the table is going to present this in terms of an average rating. So a 4 here for intensity would be at the top of the bar, and that could be represented as a percentage if you wanted to read it that way, but it's simpler and easier to think about it in terms of its intensity as an average. Okay, that all just sounds so much as I'm talking about it, but let's go ahead and just slide this down a little bit. We see the same thing now for quarterly summaries, rating, occurrence, and intensity, and we have the averages again for the year. Now let's see. The yearly average here is 58.9 for the quarter, but the yearly average here is 64. And the reason why is because this yearly average is an average of this table. And so we have different values on a monthly basis. So there is a little bit of confusion when we look at these averages. This is not an independent average, it's an average of the numbers that are above it. So when we talk about performance on the yearly basis, I like to use this average. And perhaps at some point soon, I may just actually take this out because it might be confusing to have two different yearly averages. I think I'm going to do that. But for now, well, let's look at the yearly average for this top table when we're talking about yearly averages. And this is these averages here, particularly for rating, will be sent over to the IEP tab, which is something we're going to cover on another training. Okay, so now let's click over to G2. G2 is the same kind of graph, more graphs because we're now looking at weekly summaries. And we're also now adding some of our phase changes at top here. Now we don't have a phase change line for a couple of reasons. One is there's already a lot of lines on vertical lines on this graph, and that's a little confusing. But also, a phase change can occur anywhere in the week, and so uh, if I made a phase change on Tuesday, it would be difficult on a weekly graph to show where that change would have occurred because the dot summarizes the entire week. But it does list it up at the top and gives you the date, so at least we know on 10/31. Um, there was a phase change. Now we look at the dates here, we see every other date, just so that we can keep these date, the text large enough to be able to read. So once again, top of the bar, well, let's start with rating. The rating percentage is the dot, 45.9%. Top of the bar is occurrence. So respect during that week occurred 78% of in 78% of the recording intervals, and the location of the dot on the bar tells us the intensity measure. And we see that the dot is kind of midway on this bar, which means that Pete is earning some ones and twos, occasional threes, and so forth for the week because the dot is lower than the midpoint um, on a 1 to 4 scale. So this gives you an idea of uh, how intense the behavior is when it occurs. So it's ones and twos. Here we see more threes and fours because the dot is nearing the top of the vertical bar. All right, as we scroll down, we see some of the decreasing target behaviors. And as before, in some cases, the overall um, averages and percentages, that is, are so low, and the occurrence is so low that the bar is too small and it's hidden behind the dot. So that just means that all the numbers are very low, occurrence and the rating percentage, as well as the intensity. Now, for more information, you'll need to go to the G3. That won't give you weekly information, but it will at least give you the numbers so that you can know the exact values because the graph only has so much resolution. Now, in this case, we see that 35% for that week, 35% of the recording intervals had some level of verbal aggression. So the top of the bar tells you occurrence. We see that um, overall percentage was 14% for his rating, and we see that his overall intensity was rather low because the dot is close to the bottom of the vertical bar. And physical aggression is pretty low, and we knew that from the G3 numbers and so forth. So let's now click back or actually increase the resolution one more time to the G1. Now in this case, I did go ahead and put in the vertical bars. I made them blue so they'd be distinguished from the other vertical bars that are there. So it's a lot of information going on. And we also are able to, for the G1, put in a trend line. Now you can use any start and stop dates that you want, but they have to be any start and stop dates that are also school dates. So you can't just put a calendar date in. It has to be school dates. And it's helpful to be able to summarize trends during some of these different phases. So let's say on 11/1, I wanted to see how that trend line is. And so there's the trend line starting from 11/1 to 12/11. You can see I extended it out a little bit to give an idea. Now, this dashed line, because of the calculations that are being used to create this line doesn't make it a perfectly straight line. It does sometimes have some wiggles in it, but it does show the overall trend during that phase. And if we want to see the entire thing, we would start it on A12, and just to see the overall progress for the year, a little bit of an increase, and only the dots are being considered for this trend line. Okay, so let's take a look at what we got here. Some variation for sure. Now, let's take a look at these two dots. Here we see that almost the same. Is it exactly the same? It is. These dots are exactly the same for these 2 days. The percentage of the rating points for responsibility are exactly the same. But remember, that's not the entire picture. I'm going to change the trend line. I'm just going to pick a different trend line start date. I'm just going to put, well, let's go back to 11/1. Get it out of the way. So the dots stay the same, but there's more information here. Look at the tops of the bars. Tops of the bars is occurrence. So on this day, Pete earned 50%, some non-zero value in 50% of the recording blocks, but on the next day, he earned occurrence of 40%. So what we see is Pete earned more zeros from this day to this day. That's the only reason that occurrence goes down, is when a zero was earned. So Pete was less frequently showing responsibility in his recording blocks. Well, if occurrence goes down, how could uh, these dots stay the same? They stayed the same when we consider the location of the dot on the bar, which is intensity. So even though the dot percentages are the same, turns out that his intensity, or the range of the ratings of responsibility, actually increased. Because here the dot is kind of in the lower third. Here the dot is in the middle of this vertical line. So the percentage is the same, but the percentage is obscuring the real effect that's going on. Because what's happening is he's showing responsibility less frequently, but he increased his intensity to balance it out. And so that's one example of some of the complex analyses and the density of the data that are available in the G series. Let's see if there's anything else interesting going on here. Here, we went from occurrence of 100%. When we see a 1 there, that means actually 100%. 100% of the academic blocks had a non-zero value, but on the next day, it dropped down to 75%. So he earned more zeros. The occurrence dropped because more zeros were earned. And here, the dot decreased because the zeros are being now included into that calculation, but the intensity wasn't changed. So this decrease here is not due to a change in intensity, it's due to a change in occurrence. And I know that because the relative location of the dot on the bar is approximately the same, even though there are different percentages. The intensity is the location of the dot on the bar. The relative position of the dot on the bar is going to show intensity. And let's see, one more example of something that's interesting. Well, in this case, a simpler case, occurrence stayed the same. So we know that if the dot percentage increased, which it did from here to here, it's solely due to higher values because the occurrence doesn't come into play. So when the way that you want to look at this is first look at occurrence. If occurrence changes, that's going to be one of the reasons that these percentages are going to need to be evaluated in terms of occurrence, because the occurrence changed. But if occurrence doesn't change, like it does right here, then any variation in the green dots is due to the the values of the ratings themselves, not due to occurrence, which uh, makes for a complicated analysis. And that's why the G series is so complicated, because you can't just look at the dot. You have to look at the dot, you have to look at the top of the bar and the location of the dot on the bar. And it's simpler when we go back to G3 and we can see these separated out in these columns. Graphically, when we go back to G1 or G2, it's going to display that. I find these to be useful because I've been spending so much time in them over the years. But mostly, even for myself, when I am talking about students' performance, I go back to G3. The graphs are there for you to become familiar with the graphical display, but it's really these tables in the G3 that are most useful. When I want to look at daily and weekly performance, frankly, I tend to go to the J series because it's a little easier to understand uh, the relationships that are shown there. But for completeness, we do have the G1 and the G2. And of course, as I've said a couple times, the G3 is a go-to table because it it separates out these different values. Not only gives them the numeric values, but it keeps them separate as opposed to having to combine it all graphically. But it's all here. As one of the great things about TPS is you collect the ratings and TPS does the rest. And so it's here if you want to use them. And I certainly encourage you to become familiar with those G3 graphs. Okay, well, I hope that was helpful and useful to you. Once again, Louis Werber here with Behavior Care. Thanks for being a part of the training.